Have you ever clicked a button and the window seemingly hangs? This is probably because the application is doing something synchronously. Let's say this button click leads to this function being called. In this function, we're connecting to an external API, and it's called in a synchronous way. When the current thread calls the API, the thread becomes blocking. What does that mean? It simply means the thread waits here, unable to do anything but just wait for the API to respond. While this happens, the UI cannot render, because that was the responsibility of this thread too. But since it's stuck here, waiting, nothing happens. If we would go ahead and make this function asynchronous, we could await the call to the external API. In this scenario, once the thread calls the API, we will still wait for the external API to respond, but meanwhile, the thread returns and is free to render the UI. And once we have a response, the thread can continue with the execution. But what if we're using an application without a UI? Is there a point in using Async Await in a server REST application, for example? The answer is yes, but for a different reason. If we have a server that takes in a lot of requests, and each request ultimately ends up synchronously blocking, we will eventually run the risk of thread starvation. In other words, the system will run out of threads to use. Because if every thread in the system is busy just waiting, then eventually nothing can really happen. However, if we use Async Await, the threads are free to return to the thread pool to be used for new requests while waiting. This has been a brief explanation of Async Await in C#.